Of Mice and Men, Chapter 5. The end of the great barn was piled high with new hay, and over the pile hung the 4-taloned Jackson fork suspended from its pulley. The hay came down like a mountain slope to the other end of the barn, and there was a level place as yet unfilled with the new crop. At the sides the feeding racks were visible, and between the slats the heads of horses can be seen. It was Sunday afternoon. The resting horses nibbled the remaining wisps of hay. As they stamped their feet, they bit the woods of the mangers and rattled the halter chains. The afternoon sun sliced in through the cracks of the barn walls and lay in bright lines on the hay. There was the buzzing of flies in the air, the lazy afternoon humming. From outside came the clang of horseshoes on the playing peg and the shouts of men, playing, encouraging, jeering. But in the barn it was quiet, and humming, and lazy, and warm. Only Lenny was in the barn, and Lenny sat in the hay beside a packing case under a manger in the end of the barn that had not been filled with hay. Lenny sat in the hay and looked at a little dead puppy that lay in front of him. Lenny looked at it for a long time, and then he put out his huge hand and stroked it clear from one end to the other. And Lenny said softly to the puppy, "Why do you gotta get killed? You ain't so little as mice. I didn't bounce you hard." He bent the pup's head up and looked in his face, and he said to it, "Now maybe George ain't gonna let me tend no rabbits if he finds out you got killed." He scooped a little hollow and laid the puppy in it and covered it over with hay, out of sight, but he continued to stare at the mount he had made. He said, "This ain't no bad thing like I gotta hide in the brush. Oh no, this ain't. I'll tell George I found it dead." He unburied the puppy and inspected it, and he stroked it from ears to tail. He went on sorrowfully, "But he'll know. George always knows. He'll say, 'You done it. Don't try to put nothing over on me.' And he'll say, 'Now just for that you don't get to tend no rabbits.'" Suddenly his anger arose. "God darn you!" he cried. "Why do you gotta get killed? You ain't so little as mice." He picked up the pup and hurled it from him. He turned his back on it. He sat bent over his knees and he whispered, "Now I won't get to tend the rabbits. Now he won't let me." He rocked himself back and forth in his sorrow. From outside came the clang of horseshoes on the iron stake, and then a little chorus of cries. Lenny got up and brought the puppy back and laid it in the hay and sat down. He stroked the pup again. "You wasn't big enough," he said. "They told me you wasn't. I didn't know you'd get killed so easily." He worked his finger on the pup's limp ear. "Maybe George won't care," he said. "This here goddarn little son of a gun wasn't nothing to George." What does Lenny believe will be the consequence of killing the puppy? Curly's wife came around the end of the last stall. She came very quietly, so that Lenny didn't see her. She wore her bright cotton dress and the mules with the red ostrich feathers. Her face was made up and the little sausage curls were all in place. She was quite near to him before Lenny looked up and saw her. In a panic, he shoveled hay over the puppy with his fingers. He looked sullenly up at her. She said, "What you got there, sonny boy?" Lenny glared at her. "George says I ain't having nothing to do with you. Talk to you or nothing." She laughed. "George giving you orders about everything?" Lenny looked down at the hay. "Says I can't tend no rabbits if I talk to you or anything." She said quietly, "He's scared Curly'll get mad." "Well, Curly got his arm in a sling, and if Curly gets tough, you can break his other hand. You didn't put nothing over on me about getting it caught in no machine." But Lenny was not to be drawn. "No, sir, I ain't going to talk to you or nothing." She knelt in the hay beside him. "Listen," she said. "All the guys got a horseshoe tenement going on. It's only about 4 o'clock. None of them guys is going to leave that tenement. Why can't I talk to you? I never get to talk to nobody. I get awful lonely." Lenny said, "Well, I ain't supposed to talk to you or nothing." "I get lonely," she said. "You can talk to people, but I can't talk to nobody but Curly, else he gets mad. How'd you like to not talk to anybody?" Lenny said, "Well, I ain't supposed to. George is scared I'll get in trouble." How does the contrast between Lenny's dialect and Curly's wife's dialect represent the difference between them as characters? She changed the subject. What you got covered up there? Then all of Lenny's woe came back to him. Just my pup, he said sadly. Just my little pup. And he swept the hay from on top of it. Why, he's dead, she cried. He was so little, said Lenny. I was just playing with him, and he made like he's gonna bite me. And I made like I was gonna smack him. And I done it. And then he was dead. She consoled him. Don't you worry none. He was just a mutt. You can get another one easy. The whole country's full of mutts. It ain't that so much, Lenny explained miserably. George ain't gonna let me tend no rabbits now. Why don't he? Well, he said if I'd done any more bad things, he ain't gonna let me tend the rabbits. She moved closer to him and she spoke soothingly. Don't you worry about talking to me. Listen to the guys yell out there. They got $4 bet in that tenement. None of 'em gonna leave until it's over. If George sees me talking to you, he'll give me heck, Lenny said cautiously. He told me so. Her face grew angry. What's the matter with me? She cried. Ain't I got a right to talk to nobody? What do they think I am, anyway? You're a nice guy. I don't know why I can't talk to you. I ain't doing no harm to you. Well, George says he'll get us in a mess. Aw, nuts, she said. What kind of harm am I doing to you? Seems like ain't none of 'em cares about how I gotta live. I tell 'em I ain't used to living like this. I could have made something of myself, she said darkly. Maybe I will yet. And then her words tumbled out in a passion of communication, as though she hurried before her listener could be taken away. I lived right in Salinas, she said. Come there when I was a kid. Well, a show come right through, and I met one of the actors. He says I could go with that show. But my old lady wouldn't let me. She says because I was only 15. But the guy says I coulda. If I went, I wouldn't be living like this, you bet. Lenny stroked the pup back and forth. We gonna have little plays and rabbits, he explained. She went on with her story quickly before she could be interrupted. Another time I met a guy and he was in pictures. Went out to the Riverside Dance Palace with him. He said he was going to put me in the movies, because I was a natural. Soon as he got back to Hollywood, said he was going to write me about it. She looked closely at Lenny to see whether she was impressing him. I never got that letter, she said. I always thought my old lady stole it. Well, I wasn't going to stay no place where I couldn't get nowhere or make something of myself, and where they stole your letters, I asked her if she stole it, and she says no. So I married Curly. Met him out on the Riverside Dance Palace that same night, she demanded. You listening? Me? Sure. Well, I ain't told this to nobody before. Maybe I oughtn't to. I don't like Curly. He ain't a nice fella. And because she had confided in him, she moved closer to Lenny and sat beside him. Could have been in the movies and had nice clothes, all them nice clothes like they wear. And I could have sat in them big hotels and had pictures took of me. And when they had them previews, I could have went to 'em and spoke in the radio, and it wouldn't have cost me a cent 'cause I was in the picture. And all them nice clothes like they wear. Because this guy says I was a natural. She looked up at Lenny, and she made a small, grand gesture with her arm and hand to show that she could act. The fingers trailed after her leading wrist, and her little finger stuck out grandly from the rest. Lenny sighed deeply. From outside came the clang of a horseshoe on metal, and then a chorus of cheers. Somebody made a ringer, said Curly's wife. How do Lenny and Curly's wife carry on a single conversation while talking about two completely different things? What purpose is each using the other for in this scene? Now the light was lifting as the sun was down, and the sun streaks climbed up the wall and fell over the feeding racks and over the heads of the horses. Lenny said, Maybe if I took this pup out and throwed him away, George wouldn't never know, and then I could tend the rabbits with no trouble. Curly's wife said angrily, Don't you think of nothing but rabbits? We can have a nice little place, Lenny explained patiently. We can have a house and a garden and a place for alfalfa, and that alfalfa's for the rabbits, and I take a sack and I get it full of alfalfa, and then I take it to the rabbits. she asked. "What makes you so nuts about rabbits?" Lenny had to think carefully before he could come to a conclusion. He moved cautiously close to her until he was right against her. "I like to pet nice things. Once at a fair, I seen some of them long-hair rabbits, and they was nice, you bet. Sometimes I've even pet mice, but not when I couldn't get nothing better." Curly's wife moved away from him a little. "I think you're nuts," she said. "No, I ain't," Lenny explained earnestly. "George says I ain't. I like to pet nice things with my fingers of things." She was a little bit reassured. "Well, who don't?" she said. "Everybody likes that. I like to feel silk and velvet. Do you like to feel velvet?" Lenny chuckled with pleasure. "You bet, by God!" he cried happily. "And I had some, too. A lady gave me some, and that lady was my own Aunt Clara. She gave it right to me, 'bout this big of a piece. I wished I had that velvet right now." A frown came over his face. "I lost it," he said. "I ain't seen it for a long time." Curly's wife laughed at him. "You're nuts," she said. "But you're a kind of nice fella, just like a big baby. But a person can see kind of what you mean. I'm doing my hair sometimes. I just set and stroke it 'cause it's so soft." To show how she did it, she ran her fingers over the top of her head. "Some people got kind of coarse hair," she said complacently. "Take Curly. His hair is just like wire. But mine is soft and fine. Of course, I brush it a lot. That makes it fine. Here, feel right here." She took Lenny's hand and put it on her head. "Feel right around there and see how soft it is." Lenny's big fingers fell to stroking her hair. "Don't you muss it up," she said. Lenny said, "Oh, that's nice." And he stroked harder. "Oh, that's nice. Look out now, and you'll muss it." And she cried angrily, "You stop it now, you'll mess it all up." She jerked her head sideways, and Lenny's finger closed on her hair and hung on. "Let go," she cried. "You let go!" Lenny was in a panic. His face was contorted. She screamed then, and Lenny's other hand closed over her mouth and nose. "Please don't," he begged. "Oh, please don't do that. George will be mad." She struggled violently under his hands. Her feet battered on the hay, and she writhed to be free. From under Lenny's hand came a muffled screaming. Lenny began to cry with fright. "Oh, please don't do none of that," he begged. "George gonna say I done a bad thing. He ain't gonna let me tend no rabbits." He moved his hand a little, and her hoarse cry came out. Then Lenny grew angry. "Now don't," he said. "I don't want you to yell. You will get me in trouble just like George says you will. Now don't you do that." And as she continued to struggle, and her eyes were wild with terror, he shook her then, and he was angry with her. "Don't you go yelling," he said, and he shook her, and her body flopped like a fish. And then she was still, for Lenny had broken her neck. What can we infer is the reason Curly's wife invited Lenny to pet her hair? What is the consequence of this decision? He looked down at her, and carefully he removed his hand from over her mouth. She lay still. "I don't want to hurt you," he said, "but George will be mad if you yell." She didn't answer nor move. He bent closely over her. He lifted her arm and let it drop. For a moment he seemed bewildered, and then he whispered in fright, "Oh, I done a bad thing. I done another bad thing." He pawed up the hay until it partly covered her. From outside the barn came a cry of men and the double clang of shoes on metal. For the first time, Lenny became conscious of the outside. He crouched down in the hay and listened. "I done a real bad thing," he said. "I shouldn't have done that. George will be mad, and he said, hide in the brush till he comes. He's gonna be mad. In the brush till he comes. That's what he said." Lenny went back and looked at the dead girl. The puppy lay close to her. Lenny picked it up. "I'll throw him away," he said. "It's bad enough like it is." He put the pup under his coat and crept to the barn wall and peered out between the cracks toward the horseshoe game. Then he crept around toward the end of the last manger and disappeared. The sunstreaks were high on the wall by now, and the light was growing soft in the barn. Curly's wife lay on her back, and she was half covered with hay.